Hi, everybody. My name is Ashawn Crawley, and I'm coming to you again for Intro to African American Studies for people who are in the course. For folks who aren't in the course, I'm just coming to you, hopefully, to not bore you. Um, in the age of COVID, trying to figure out methods for discussing the current crisis or the current sort of inflection that the crisis of ongoing problems with racial capitalism has taken. Um, and so for today, what my students have read is the first chapter of Keeanga Yamada Taylor's book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Um, I think it's an excellent book that tries to talk about sort of the history of Black freedom struggle on one hand, but also the problems that Black folks have had to encounter in terms of ways to produce something like liberation. So I'm really thankful for the text. I'm really thankful for what it allows us to think about, what it allows us to think through. Um, and before I begin, I want to say what I always say, which is I hope that you all are well. I hope that you all are taking good care as much as possible. As the weeks progress with COVID 19, more and more of us are being confronted with the fact that the virus is spreading to folks that we know, and it is becoming inescapable. And it's sad and it's heartbreaking. I was talking to my mother this weekend, and she was telling me about some of the folks in New Jersey, where I'm from, some of the people who I was acquainted with from as a youngster, whose churches we fellowshipped with a lot as a young person, people who saw me grow up, and telling me that, several people unfortunately contracted COVID-19 and have passed away in the last weeks. Um, and I was telling her about some folks that I knew that passed away, and I began crying just because it's all so much. I said it before, and I'll say it again. It feels very surreal. It feels like I'm at a temporal disjuncture, or like I'm disjointed temporally. I feel like I'm still in February. Parts of me feel like I'm in December of last year. A lot emotionally, and then like things that have started to begin happening with COVID around the end of February, or really the middle of February, but definitely by the end of February, began to pay attention more and still feel stuck there. Um, and being stuck there, but also in those three different kind of places, but then also like the deaths that are occurring, and sort of having no place to really grieve publicly together with other folks is another layer of the difficulty. And it can all feel like too much. I know folks who are with family, folks who are with partners, folks who are with children that are feeling very much like stressed because they're with people and they're kind of in the same place with the same folks all day. And then there are folks like me who live alone, who kind of wish that we have people with us to endure something like this socially distancing crisis. All that to say that the crisis means that there is no preferable kind of location or place where one can be. If you're with someone, you're probably tired of them. If you're by yourself, you're tired of yourself. And so it just all feels like hard. And so I want to, every time before I ever, talk about anything else, just kind of want to talk about how hard this is and how difficult it is and how emotionally taxing it is, and how fatiguing it is. I'm tired of screens, tired of computer screens, tired of my TV, tired of FaceTime, tired of looking at my phone. There's just, I want to see people, and I want the energy of people in a kind of fleshly way. And so this is a hard moment. And I don't want to listen to the projections, but a lot of the projections are not encouraging for the time that they are saying it will take at least to find a vaccine that could be sort of put to use in a large scale way, in a way that would be useful for us. So, I'm hearing things anywhere between like August, September until like early 2021. Um, and I just can't imagine kind of socially distancing for that amount of time. This is for me the sixth week of social distancing. Um, and it's just going to become more and more difficult, I think. Um, so love the people that you love. Tell the folks that you love them. Care about the people that you care about. Um, we are finding out again our fragility and our vulnerability. And we can celebrate still the fact that we are fragile, that we are vulnerable. We can celebrate that because it just means we're human. We're creatures existing in a creaturely way. And if we honor the fact of our fragility, then we can do things to make connections with one another, even through this crisis. Um, so we've read the first chapter of Keeanga Yamada Taylor's From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And there are just a couple of quotes that I want to sort of raise for us to think about together. The first is when she quoted from Thomas Jefferson in this chapter. Thomas Jefferson, who's the founder of the University of Virginia, where I teach, says the following quote. He's talking about Negroes. His imagination is wild and extravagant, escapes incessantly from every restraint of reason and taste, and, in the course of its vagaries, leaves a tract of thought as incoherent and eccentric as is the course of the meteor through the sky, end quote. There's something very fascinating about this idea of the Negro imagination as the thing that incessantly escapes, the thing that constantly escapes, the thing that is ongoingly living in the posture and the practice of escape. There's something very beautiful about that to me. Because what it means is that there's this fundamental recognition that the kinds of practices of marginalization, oppression, violence, and violation that folks like Thomas Jefferson were enacting on this population of people is a practice that he fundamentally recognized was incorrect, and that he fundamentally recognized that there was a freedom drive, a liberation drive, a move towards liberatory practice and breath that these folks were living that could not be captured by the system of political economic exploitation at all. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about him saying that the Negro imagination is wild and extravagant and escapes incessantly is the fact that I think that that's the thing that Thomas Jefferson desires most for his own imagination. But because he has submitted his imagination to the practices of the political economy of racial capitalism and exploitation, that what he relinquishes in the moment that he desires to conspire with and benefit from this political economy of exploitation, what he relinquishes is his own capacity for imagination that constantly escapes. What does one need, literally, in order to do the thing that he says is necessary, the pursuit of happiness? What you have to do in the pursuit of happiness is for your imagination to constantly or incessantly escape the strictures of the bounds in which it finds itself. So it seems to me one of the things that animates Thomas Jefferson's thinking, and the thing that Thomas Jefferson is constantly relinquishing his relation to, is the kind of practice that Negro imagination is doing, that Black imagination is the practice of this incessant escape, this escape from being captured, this escape from being enclosed, this escape from being violated. And that is what then produced the occasion for its own violation, right? Thomas Jefferson desires, in other words, what I'm trying to say. Thomas Jefferson desires the kind of imagination that he notices the ones who are marginalized have, and he recognizes that he doesn't have it insofar as he's had to relinquish so much of his own capacity for being human. Another way to talk about imagination that incessantly escapes is the practice of being human against the practice of being modern man as white landed gentry. That this practice of the creaturely mode of existence that recognizes your fragility and your vulnerability as the grounds of our existence, your giving up of your fragility and your vulnerability in the service of becoming like a modern man or a citizen or a subject. Once you give up your fragility and your vulnerability, what you also do is you give up your incessant you give up your imaginative capacity that is about the practice of incessant escape. Because what does imagination have to do with vulnerability and fragility? Well, if you recognize the fact that your existence is the grounds of your existence is as vulnerability and the grounds of your existence is as fragile, what you do is you harness the capacity of creative imagination in order to figure out methods for existing in this world with other people, honoring the fact of rather than attempting to dismiss or to get rid of the fact of your vulnerability. You have to live a creative life, in other words. You have to live an imaginative life. And you have to do it as a group practice. You have to do it as a collective improvisational process, right? And so what one does, or what Thomas Jefferson, it seems to me, recognizes is the imagination, the Black imagination as this thing that constantly escapes the attempts of the political economy and the attempts to harness it for its good. This is necessary, and I'm going to return to Thomas Jefferson in this quote towards the end. So I'm glad that Taylor began there. On page 27 of the e-book version of the text, she says the following, quote, explanations for Black inequality that blame Black people for their own oppression transform material causes into subjective causes. The problem is not racial discrimination in the workplace or residential segregation. It is Black irresponsibility, erroneous social mores, and general bad behavior. Ultimately, this transformation is not about race or even white supremacy, but about making sense of our rationalizing poverty and inequality in ways that absolve the state and capital of any culpability, end quote. Here is a demonstration, it seems to me, of what it means to relinquish one's capacity for imaginative possibility in the service of something like rationalization and reason. Rationalization as the method through which we come to understand something as making sense, right? That what Taylor's trying to say is that there is this philosophical, theological, sociological project that comes to say the reason why Black folks are oppressed is because there's a fundamental flaw that is wrong with them. So the transformation of systems of inequity that is maintained through institutions into personal, moral, and ethical failures is the problem and the production of white supremacist thought. So whenever we find pressure that is applied to individuals, saying what they should do and how they continue to fail to thwart how they continue to thwart their own so-called success, we find the practice and the application of white supremacist ideology, white supremacy as a kind of philosophy. So I'm thinking of, like, for example, the Surgeon General last week, who was saying that Black and brown people need to talk to their moms and their pops and their abuelas. And he chided Black and brown folks for going to liquor stores and saying you shouldn't be going to liquor stores, you should be staying home, right? That what pretended to be, or what appeared from him, according to his own thought and logic, to be a desire to produce sort of culturally sensitive connections and messaging was actually just paternalism and white supremacist thought. Why? Because what he did is he said that the reason why Black folks are contracting and dying from COVID-19 more than any other racial ethnic group is because of things like they're not talking to their grandparents. They're not talking to their aunties and their uncles. They're not talking to they're going to liquor stores, right? They are constantly exposing themselves. We are constantly exposing ourselves to COVID-19 because of our lack of moral and ethical sort of conviction and clarity, the lack of our moral and ethical sort of fitness and rightness for being a proper kind of citizen. What's fascinating to me is none of this was said during spring break when white kids were in Florida, 18, 19, 20 years old. Like, I'm 18, I'm not going to catch it. And if I do, it's okay, right? I'm going to survive. That lots and lots of people who were not Black were doing similar kinds of gatherings in public when it was told not to gather in public. Lots and lots of non-Black people were exposing themselves intentionally, saying things like, well, it's not going to matter because I can survive it because I'm young. But the idea is that if Black folks do the same kind of thing, it is because of a moral and ethical failure on the part of Black folks or on the part of brown people, as opposed to the lack of moral and ethical fitness and rightness on the side or on the part of white young folks who do the same thing. And so again, it is the social meanings that we have attached to the racial hierarchy that then comes to inflect how we understand the same behaviors that people engage. That the same behaviors will be understood differently based on the racial hierarchy and the social meaning that we have attached to where someone fits along that racial hierarchy. On page 29, she says, quote, American exceptionalism operates as a mythology of convenience that does a tremendous amount of work to simplify the contradiction between the apparent creed of US society and its much more complicated reality. Where people have failed to succeed and cash in on the abundance that American ingenuity has apparently created, their personal failures or deficiencies serve as the explanation, end quote. And so I've been wondering, how does the myth of sort of American exceptionalism operate during a crisis like COVID-19? It means that we have to search for the moral and ethical failures of the masses as to why they cannot receive adequate health care, housing, resources, food, etc. We say that they don't understand financial literacy. I've seen so many posts on Facebook and Twitter, specifically targeting Black folks, but not only Black folks, but specifically targeting Black folks, saying things like, well, you need to use this time to figure out financial literacy. You need to use this time to figure out how to save money. You need to use this time while you're at home to save as much money as possible because you have been wasting your own money, you moral and ethically incorrect person, right? Lots of messaging about how people should have saved up 6 months worth of financial resources from which to live through a crisis, even though there is nowhere in the country in which a person can work 40 hours with a minimum wage job and provide a 2-bedroom house or a 2-bedroom apartment. And even though 80% of Black and brown folks cannot work from home during this particular crisis, which means that people are essential workers, meaning that they have to expose themselves to the virus daily, 80% of Black and brown people, 80%, right? That we exist in a society that is highly stratified based on race. And the idea of American exceptionalism is constantly being undone by the very practices of race and racism that is sort of being produced constantly as the ways through which we sort our people, the ways we sort individuals, and thus we make people more or less vulnerable to biological facts like the COVID-19 virus. That American exceptionalism as the idea that we are the city set upon the hill, that we are the greatest nation in the world, that we are the leaders of the free world. All of these ideas are a mythology that America attempts to live up to while having this deeply contradictory relation to people who are citizens of the United States. And this based on race, this based on class, this based on gender identity, this based on sexual orientation, that the very methods through which we sort the very methods through which we sort individuals based on categories of identity actually undo the very concept of the mythology of American exceptionalism. And so what must be done in order to maintain the mythology of American exceptionalism is the idea that, well, the reason why the masses are not succeeding is because the masses have moral and ethical failures. And it can't then just be about Black folks having or lacking moral and ethical clarity and fitness. It has to be that the masses in general have to lack moral and ethical clarity, and that only if they would act better, then they would have the kind of money, the resources in order to survive and succeed and to thrive in this political economy that is predicated upon exploitation. And so the mythology is a mythology that it can only be maintained through the constant violence and violation against the masses, rising up against it. On page 33, Taylor says, quote, "The volatile politics surrounding who should be eligible for public welfare also aided in creating the political categories of deserving and undeserving. These concerns overlap with the growing popularity of culture as a critical framework for understanding the failure to find the American dream." End quote. This seems to me to be true today as well. If we think about undocumented workers, how undocumented workers pay more proportionally in taxes, um, than people who we consider to be citizens of the United States. And yet, people who are undocumented are not allowed to file for unemployment, are not allowed to receive Medicaid or Medicare. In other words, they pay taxes into a system that fundamentally excludes them, while also, this is the important part, blaming them for the practice of violent exclusion as a personal, immoral, and ethical failure. So not only are you paying taxes more proportionally than other folks are into the system that is predicated upon exploitation of the masses, you pay more into it, but then you cannot benefit at all from the money that you pay into the system. So you're fundamentally excluded from any of the benefits that taxpayers would receive from the system, while at the same time, you are blamed for the reason why you are excluded from the system. You're undocumented. And not only are you undocumented, sort of according to the juridical or according to the law, you get then, because you are undocumented, according to the mythology of American exceptionalism, which necessitates a kind of blaming of the masses for their own problems, then you get transformed as an undocumented person into a person who is morally and ethically a failure to live up to the sort of status of the citizen because it is your fault that you are the reason why you cannot be a citizen, and thus you are the reason why you are exploited. It's not the system of economic exploitation. It's not the system of politics. It is you are the reason why you are losing. And it's a kind of ingenious political economy insofar as what it can do then is it can constantly then target you as a moral and ethical agent and say, if only you did better, you would be able to succeed in the system. And so what it does then it individualizes what is a systemic practice that is institutionally produced and maintained. And by transforming it into an individual practice and process, then what the individual then attempts to do with as much power, with as much with as much energy as possible, is to prove that as an individual, I can do good. And so you try to correct your morals, you try to correct your ethics in order to be more aligned with the system of inequity that has exploited you. It's ingenious because it almost disallows a real critique of the systemic practice of injustice because you spend so much energy trying to attack the moral and ethical failures that supposedly you are producing, right? And so what we have to do is we have to recalibrate. We have to refocus our attention not on individual so-called moral and ethical failures. This is why mutual aid, which is what we talked about in the last video, in the last course, or in the last class meeting, mutual aid is important because mutual aid says it's not the individual's fault that they're not housed. It's not the individual's fault that they don't have clothing. It's not the individual's fault that they don't have health care. It is the failure of the state to take care of people who are paying into a system that is supposed to benefit them. And so mutual aid says that everyone is welcome to benefit. We're going to share together because we all have need. It's not about your moral and ethical fitness in order to receive aid. It's about the fact that you need. Or another way to say it is like it's the fact that you breathe, which is the reason why we're going to try to feed you. The reason why we're going to try to give you clothing, the reason why we're going to try to provide things like shelter. Mutual aid then is a practice of, again, otherwise possibility. It's a practice of an alternative to the normative understanding of a moral and ethical failure on the part of the individual. And it says, no, it's not you. It's the system of inequity. What Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is showing us with a kind of scrutinizing detail is that there are so many ways that the problems that are in the way of Black liberation are the constant and incessant transformations of the systemic and inequitable practices that are produced through and maintained by institutions into moral and ethical failures on the part of the individual. This transformation is the same transformation that is about the relinquishment of one's capacity for imagination that incessantly escapes the stricture or the boundary of the law, the stricture and the boundary of theology, the stricture and the boundary of philosophy. These various sort of disciplines that tell us the kind of moral and ethical people that we should aspire to, which are always the kind of moral and ethical people we should aspire to in the direction of the sustenance of the state, as opposed to in the direction of the sustenance of care for the masses. And so this is why the practice of imagination, the practice of Black imagination as the thing that incessantly escapes, is a thing that we have to think about, that Thomas Jefferson said, a thing we have to think about, a thing we have to sort of worry over, and the thing that we have to attempt to cultivate against like the practice of racial capitalism. The idea of the culture of poverty as a pivot away from biological racism, this is one of the things that Taylor talks about. The culture of racism being a concept that, oh, it's the problem that Black people are confronted with is it's the culture. It's not a biologically based sort of pathology, it's a culturally based pathology. The idea of the culture of poverty as a pivot away from biological racism as a solution, think about culture as opposed to biology, is still a problem because it treats the ones impacted by systemic practices of inequity as the ones that are pathological. It never says that is the very structure itself that we think that we should understand people and their behavior. Is that pathological, or is that the thing that we have to interrogate and perhaps get rid of? And it says, no, it's your inability to fit in to this culture now that is the problem. It's not your biological unfitness. It's not the weakest. You're not the weakest link in terms of biology. You're the weakest link in terms of a social evolutionary practice of sort of movement, progression, and linearity. That your culture is the thing that is stunted, not your biological fact. But it still thinks that, well, there is a normative ideal towards which you should aspire, and that normative ideal remains whiteness, whether it be whiteness as biological, or whiteness as cultural, or whiteness as philosophical, or whiteness as theological, or whiteness as sociological. But what it does is what remains is a concept of the normative that is the ideal towards which people should aspire. And that's not a thing that I think we should do. We should be fully willing to interrogate the very concept of the normative, because the normative is itself a concept that is produced by and produces violence against the masses. Such that, to go back to Thomas Jefferson, the movement away from biological racism to the concept of culture still treats the imaginative flight towards escape as evidence of pathology, whether biologically based or cultural. This is why I kind of get really sort of annoyed at this point with the question of sexuality. Is it biologically based? Is it biology or social? Right? Because in either case, what it seems to me to do is to still allow for the idea that there is this normative sort of understanding of sexuality towards a normative ideal of sexuality towards which the masses should approach, and that whether practices of sexuality are biologically based or socially based, that there is a normative ideal and we should try to figure out a way to get towards that thing. And at this point, I kind of don't even care if it's biological or social, because I think both of those concepts are being used in the service of the production of a normative concept of what it means to exist as a sexual person, as a sexual being amongst other people. And perhaps what we need to do is to let go or relinquish the anxiety over the very capacity to produce an explanation in the service of the state, right? Um, we have to ask, in other words, how imaginative practices can become the basis from which to produce otherwise possibility, and how such practices and thinking can be a model for us to practice something like liberation. Perhaps it's not a failure of imagination, but the articulation of one's values that we're constantly seeing. That one of the things that I think that Thomas Jefferson makes clear for me when he says that the Black imagination or the Negro imagination is this thing that is incessantly escaping. And that for him, that then constitutes its pathological nature. The pathological nature is the nature of one that is constantly seeking to escape being bound, right? That he's not only articulating a fact of a failure of his imagination, but also he's articulating his value, such that the failure of his imagination is the articulation of a value that deems imagination as unnecessary for life and living. That is what's devastating to me, is that what he relinquishes is not only like imagination because he thinks that Black folks are doing imagination in this kind of pathological way, but that the very value system that he is sort of existing within understands imagination itself as the thing that incessantly escapes, and thus the thing to incessantly be relinquished in the service of being reasonable, in the service of being something like rational. That this is the thing that we are confronted with. That how can we recognize imagination as the thing that we need? This is why I talk to y'all about cartoons all the time. I think they're important because they cultivate a practice towards imagination. And so I want to think with you all some more about the practice of imagination, the practice of otherwise possibility, the practice of alternatives existing in the here and now. And I want us to think about how COVID-19 is another articulation of the ongoing problem, the ongoing crisis of racial capitalism. And what are some ways that we can imagine with one another other modalities of existence in the service of the practice of liberation, in the service of care, being the grounds to which we understand ourselves and our relations to one another. I hope this is useful. Thanks for joining again. Talk to you soon.